My correct name has now come up. Good, thank you. Right, Sean, Funzo Mala, I think you're in Colombia at the moment.
That's right, in Bogota.
Thank you so much for making contact with us. Sean and I have been arguing with each other and exchanging ideas and papers for some years now around issues of publishing, incentives, and so on. And he's recently written a book called The Incentivized University, Scientific Revolutions, Policies, Consequences. And at the launch about a month ago, it really brought home the urgency globally, not just in South Africa, but globally, of trying to make sense of what is this thing called the incentivized university and how does it shape, affect, or even distort our professional practices. So I'm very pleased that we were able to track you down in Colombia and invite you to present. So just very quickly, Sean currently is the Senior Research Fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. It's a wonderful kind of Bellagio type place in a kind of converted castle somewhere close to UJ. He's an economist, holds degrees from University of Cape Town, where he was the Woodrow Wilson Public Policy Partnership Fellow, and also one from the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. And his work spans the spectrum from real-world policy to abstract theoretical analysis, from advising members of Parliament on public finance issues and legislation to methodological and philosophical critique of approaches, which I think locates him absolutely perfectly to dealing with this town gown theory practice problem that we're all dealing with as academics, as we face a very stressed world going into the future. So, Sean, I'm not going to take up any more time. It's over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Kian. And good afternoon to everybody, well, in South Africa, South African time. It's about just after 6 a.m. here in Bogota. I'm going to, I hope you won't hear any of the traffic noise. There's a bit of traffic noise here, but I'm using headphones to try and avoid that. Thanks so much for the invitation and the opportunity to present. I would have very much liked to either be in the same time zone as you or be there with you in person for those at the physical gathering. And also to actually listen to some of the proceedings that have been taking place. It looked like a very interesting program. With that all said, let me get into the content of my presentation today, which, as Kian has said, is based on a book I published at the beginning of this year with Springer called The Incentivized University. And what I'll do is I'm going to give you an overview of the book, and I'll drill down into some specific issues that I think might be of particular interest to this audience, and conclude with some reflections, might be some punchy reflections on the implications for South African higher education. Let me just see if I can scroll through here. There we go. Okay, so that's the cover of the book over there. I'm going to give you an overview of a quick overview of the book and the structure. I think I have about 40 minutes or so, so I'll try and stick to my time to leave a bit of time at the end for Q&A and keep the program on track. So the first part of the book is basically trying to give the reader a sense of what it's about and why you should care. In particular, I try to make a case that in order to engage with this question of the importance and the impact of incentives for our universities, we need to actually go down to what one might call a deeper philosophical level. We actually need to consider philosophical issues, and not necessarily some of the philosophical issues that some higher education academics might be more familiar with, issues of ethics and so on, but actually questions about intellectual and scientific progress. The second part of the book, and the organization I'm using here is not, in fact, exactly the same as in the book. The book has got a very detailed table of contents, and if you're interested, I would definitely recommend you go and look at that on the Springer site, because it'll give you a sense really of the content of the different chapters and so forth. But in the second part of the book, I get into the actual philosophy of science. And when I originally set out to write the book, I didn't anticipate that I would spend so much time on this section, or indeed that a number of the key contributions of the book would be of this section. So one of the slightly difficult sells, as it were, is persuading philosophers that there are actually important contributions, or potentially important contributions at least, that they should engage with within this book that is more broadly about higher education and the role of the university and the dynamics of incentives within universities. So the second part is philosophy of science, but I have written it in such a way that it's intended to be accessible to a non-philosopher reader. My own background, as Kian mentioned at the beginning, is in fact in economics. And so I think there's some advantages to that in terms of making philosophical analysis more accessible. And then in this second broad part, in the first section, I get into the dynamics of modern higher education. So having laid out these philosophical foundations relating to intellectual progress, and this draws on existing figures within philosophy, people like Thomas Kuhn, Karl Popper, Lakatos, Feyerabend, and others, significant theorists and authors in philosophy and philosophy of science. I then move on to a relatively brief characterization of the dynamics of modern higher education. And as Kian said, this is not a book about South Africa. This is a book about global higher education. It probably does have what one might call a Western and Anglophone bias because of my own positioning. But my broad sense is that it does quite accurately capture the trajectory of the modern academy globally. If one looks at work that's been done in China and in India, but which I cite in the book, it's pretty consistent with the kind of characterization that appears in these chapters. So having set out the philosophical foundations, I then provide a brief characterization of those dynamics. And then in the subsequent chapters, I link the philosophy to the actual dynamics. So how does the philosophical literature and the framework that I put together in chapters 3 to 6, how does that actually help us understand the implications of these dynamics for the purposes of modern higher education? And when I say that, I think it's very important to emphasize, although it'll be fine for this audience, but it's very important to emphasize that largely I don't say much at all about pedagogy. I don't say much about the teaching side, except to the extent that I recognize that that is neglected because of the emphasis on research, both legitimate emphasis and excessive emphasis on research. So I don't say much about pedagogy. I say a little bit about textbooks and Thomas Kuhn's theory about textbooks and how those reflect a particular and often inaccurate notion of intellectual and scientific progress. But beyond that, I'm focused on research, and I think that's defensible in order to keep the scope of the book reasonably narrow. In chapter 11, I use the example of economics, my own original discipline, to illustrate how the dynamics that I raised concerns about in preceding chapters can manifest in very specific ways. And I think this is, of course, one reason I chose it is because it's the discipline I'm most familiar with, and a lot of the work that a lot of the academic work I do is about economics, philosophy of economics, and methodology of economics. But also because economics occupies a special status within the social sciences, there is a sense in which the characterization is useful for and carries over to some of the other social sciences, especially ones that like to imitate economics. We see that, for example, particularly in political science, which in many ways tends to imitate the trends in academic economics. And then finally, in these last few chapters 12 and 13, which I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on today, get into the nuances and variation of the preceding generic and general arguments. And then in the final chapter, I draw my conclusions using what originally I thought I might use actually as the chapter of the book, the title "Scientific Revolutions Will Not Be Incentivized." So that gives you a sense of what I have in mind. In some sense, that's actually quite a narrow statement. Those of you who are familiar with Thomas Kuhn's philosophy of science, he has this notion of revolutionary science versus what he calls normal science. and I have some separate work also that I'm developing on that. But scientific revolutions are sort of crucial events within the context of scientific progress, but actually characterize a relatively limited period of time. And well, I get to this a little bit later, but what I could also have said is that normal science, so-called normal science, is such that it doesn't actually need to be incentivized. It has a certain logic and a certain momentum of its own, which is actually also not going to be changed to a great degree by incentives, except to the extent that its less good characteristics are amplified. Okay, but I'll get back to that. So hopefully that gives you a broad sense of what the book's about. Now, just to say, as Kian has mentioned, I've been writing about related issues for quite a long time, and in fact, over 10 years now, as one of these articles reflects, and that was really from coming face to face as a young academic with the realities of how the academy actually functions in comparison to the principles on which it is notionally founded and the rhetoric about how it is supposed to function. So coming face to face with the contrast between those things led me to start paying, I guess, more attention to them and raising concerns about them, partly in the local context. But as you can see from the titles of these articles and these papers, my concern with university rankings was not just about the South African context. The concern with a sort of metric-based university that churns out publications and so forth is also not particularly to South Africa. The publish or perish phenomenon is a worldwide concern, and I use a quote in the book, which I found, I think, last year or year before, from Hannah Arendt. I think it was for about the 1970s, complaining about publish or perish. So, it's certainly been a problem that's been growing over time. And in this International Journal of Educational Development article that I wrote, I tried to use the insights that I'd gained from observing the South African Academy to inform understanding of these global dimensions. And that's actually my most referenced paper thus far. And it's been very clear that it resonates with higher education scholars globally, which is gratifying. But again, emphasize the point that the dynamics that we see in South Africa are often part of a global trend, albeit with some important local context, which I'll get onto later. And then just a brief mention for this paper title at the bottom left of the slide, which is actually about decolonizing the economics curriculum. And on the face of it, that might seem like quite a different question, but actually it's not, because it's about epistemology. It's about what we include in our research. It's about worldviews and what is prioritized within our institutions. And I'll get back to that. But essentially, the point to be made that this book has, in some sense, been in conceptual development for some time, even though I only made the decision to try and write it back in 2016. Okay, so in the remainder of the presentation, what I'm going to focus on is these 4 points or 4 sets of issues. The first is to give you a sense of the crux of the general argument. Okay, so I've given you an overview of the book, but I haven't really told you what the core argument is. In the second part, I want to talk about variation across disciplines, societies, and institutions. That corresponds to, I think it's chapter, always forget the chapter numbers, I think it's chapter 12. Then I want to talk about implications for the periphery, which is where I classify South Africa as being. For those of you, many of you might be familiar with this core periphery distinction. So in our context, I think the core would be parts of the Western Academy in economics and some degree in philosophy. I just attended a philosophy of science conference in Pittsburgh, which is the main philosophy of science conference. But the organizing association is called the Philosophy of Science Association, but it's very much based in North America. The same is true in economics. So actually, in the disciplines I primarily work in, the core is in North America and a subset of departments there. But one could talk about, say, the Anglophone Academy. And South Africa is kind of quite peripheral. And you can look at, obviously, those of you familiar with science metrics and so forth, you can very much see that if you choose to map that out in some kind of quantitative way. And I'll talk about the links to decolonization there very briefly, and that corresponds to chapter 13 of the book. And then, primarily for the purposes of this meeting, I'm going to give you some thoughts for South Africa. These do not come directly from the book, but rather a combination of my pre-existing thinking and engagements with people like Kayan. I'll make a particular reference to where Kayan has informed my thinking on some of these issues. and then yeah, and then wrap up with some punchy thoughts about South Africa. So the general argument goes a little bit like this, and what's been interesting about putting the argument together is that in many ways it uses positions on crucial issues that are quite, I would say, quite intuitive, to the point where I think one of my challenges with philosophers of science is to actually get the position taken seriously as a consequence. And fortunately, I think it is possible to do that, because if they read carefully, they can see the implications. Anyway, but for example, the starting point of the book is to say, well, to the extent that we're focusing on research within higher education, that's about intellectual inquiry. It's about, as human beings, trying to understand the world. And we do that. And I focus down, and again, I guess this is important for this audience. I focus down on the natural and social sciences, partly for the sake of just a narrower focus to develop the argument, but also because it makes it easier when it comes to terminology and so forth. Of course, if you're dealing with, for example, literary studies, then referring to intellectual progress, it's a much less clearly defined notion than if we refer to, say, progress in the natural sciences, if we refer to progress in physics, or we refer to progress in medicine. But that's not to say that the arguments don't carry over. I think many of them do, but one necessarily requires a slightly different conception of what intellectual progress or progress within inquiry means in other kinds of disciplines. Okay, so within the natural and social sciences, I suggest as a starting point, the primary purpose of intellectual inquiry is better understanding and knowledge of the world. And I use the notion of approximation of truth, which is probably the closest recognized stance within philosophy of science. Okay, so you can think about it as pursuing truth itself. Philosophers tend to be quite skeptical, if not of the existence of truth, then the possibility of actually finding truth per se, but they think that it might be plausible to get best approximations of truth. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So that's the starting point. The stated purpose of incentives for research in higher education is typically to advance progress. It might be to advance intellectual progress, or oftentimes it's to ostensibly to advance societal progress. Policymakers will say, well, we're going to create, policymakers or university managers will say, well, we're going to create incentives because we think that's more likely to lead to important scientific discoveries or important intellectual contributions, or we're going to reward the people who produce important intellectual or societal contributions, right? And that prompts a crucial question, which is, should we expect such incentives to advance progress? Now, I think many people who advocate the use of incentives, and I use that term broadly, although I get into a lot more detail in the book, typically take it for granted that using incentives, as messy as it might be in practice and as imperfect as it might be, will to some degree achieve the objectives, right? So if we incentivize a particular behavior, then to some degree that behavior will become more pronounced. That's quite a questionable assumption, and there are existing literatures within economics, for example, which examine the degree to which that's true. And there's quite a substantial literature, right, separately from these questions in higher education, that suggests that incentives can have quite perverse effects, and they can even have effects that are counterproductive. In other words, they can hinder the achievement of the objective rather than advance it. So this is, in fact, a very important question. And what the book suggests, after 150 or 200 pages or so, is that careful consideration of how incentives of various kinds, whether it's based on impact metrics or publication output or impact factors or these kinds of things, careful consideration of how those combine with existing dynamics within the academic community, within academic institutions and so forth, suggests that, in fact, incentives are not likely to advance progress. And the slight nuance on that is to say that in good scenarios, by which I mean scenarios in which intellectual inquiry is being pursued broadly in a manner consistent with the founding principles okay, of the academy. Incentives are not going to make a lot of difference. In bad scenarios, on the other hand, where various kinds of principles are being violated, incentives can make the situation much worse. So that being the case, we should probably be seriously reconsidering the use of incentives and this overall approach, which I locate along with other authors in the context of a broader managerialist approach to higher education, new public management, what has been referred to as essentially the neoliberal approach to higher education. There's not much in the book that's really can be called political, but obviously there are political associations with some of these approaches to higher education. And so given that very brief summary of the argument, the conclusion of the book is that things like scientific revolutions, breakthroughs, intellectual breakthroughs in intellectual progress within particular disciplines are not going to be incentivized. Basically because those kinds of things are ruptures within the existing dynamics. If you read somebody like Thomas Kuhn, his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is his most famous book from the 1960s, scientific revolutions happen when incumbents can't really resist the evidence for a new theory or a new paradigm being better than the existing theory or paradigm. But in Kuhn's characterization, which I believe is correct, although he walks it back a little bit later, the incumbents really resist that. And they resist it in what one might call, this is controversial in the philosophy literature, but less so, I think, outside philosophy, in what one might call an irrational way or an illegitimate way. Namely that incumbent, if we think of scientists, incumbent scientists resist a new paradigm, even though there's evidence accumulating to show that the existing paradigm is flawed and the new paradigm is better, but there needs to be a substantial weight of evidence beyond what might have been required ex ante before any given paradigm or theory was adopted in order to overcome that resistance. And what I suggest in the book is that incentives will compound that resistance, essentially because, to summarize, it will reward incumbents, it will reward that kind of resistance, and it will penalize outsiders. It will, and one can define outsiders in a number of different ways, but essentially the incentives make scientific revolutions much less likely. Okay, and what I could or should have added, as I said earlier, is that normal science, which Kuhn characterizes as kind of the humdrum day-to-day puzzle solving of scientists, but also accompanied by these negative tendencies to suppress, for example, contradictory evidence. Normal science doesn't need to be incentivized. It's going to happen anyway because it's driven by these other kinds of dynamics. But its harmful characteristics will be amplified by incentives. And what we in fact should want to do, given the principles that I kind of suggest we start out with, is to mitigate those harmful characteristics, right? So we should be thinking of doing something other than using incentives. And I'll get back to what that other thing might have been. So this is figure 2 from the book. I found that visualizing my thinking was quite helpful. I don't know whether it's quite as helpful for the reader, but this looks complicated, but it isn't really. And as I say, it's actually it's a very simple representation of what scientific progress might look like. Essentially, we start out at this point on the bottom left here at time t equal to 0. And what we want to do is we want to get close to truth, or we want to approximate truth. So that's the dotted line with an arrow towards truth. Some progress has been made over whatever the preceding period is, and we've ended up at the status quo, which is kind of there in the current status quo, which is there in the middle at time t. And then the question is, well, what is going to determine whether we get closer or not to truth from this point? And at the bottom there, I suggest that there's kind of an intrinsic, it's typically, given the nature essentially of these human institutions, these human communities, there's a certain conformist momentum, which is going to retain the pre-existing trajectory, whether or not it's actually getting us close to the truth or not. And there are these kinds of non-scientific factors. So the sort of psychology of incumbents, the fact that they might not want to recognize that some of their previous work was incorrect or misplaced. They might not want to recognize the status of people who have not trained under a similar paradigm and so forth. So that conformist momentum and those non-scientific factors are going to kind of push in the same direction and sort of in some sense maintain the status quo, even though it's not truth approximating. What we want is to amplify the forces that are going to push us towards truth approximation. So, for example, merit-based assessment of competing theories is what I show there. I mean, that's ultimately, it's pretty, there are a few sort of exceptions in the philosophy literature, but by and large, certainly the vast majority of practicing scientists or social scientists would agree that what we are supposed to be doing as academics is making merit-based assessment of contributions to these areas. Contributions shouldn't be assessed because, first and foremost, because of the prestige of the author or because of favoring one particular point of view over another, especially, for example, if you're doing empirical work, work should be assessed on its merits. So in some sense, that's kind of an easy argument to make, even though I suggest and I cite various sources that that's very much not what's happening in the modern academy. So that's the graphical version. Maybe it'll help some of you. Perhaps it'll confuse others. So the question then is, if not incentives, then what? And what I suggest quite briefly in the concluding chapter of the book is that what we need to do is focus on aligning actual dynamics with the foundational principles. And again, it seems a simple thing to say, but it's not something that emerges very clearly at all from any of the other literature. Yeah. So to be, say, specific, and I again cite various examples in the book, there's nothing about the following that are consistent with or required by, important point, truth-seeking and the pursuit of knowledge, bullying, harassment, intellectual theft, fraud, methodological misconduct, cronyism, peer or prestige effect, etc. What we see, though, is that far more policymaker attention and resources appears to be focused on incentivizing research outputs, trying to reward particular academics and so forth, but not dealing with these fundamental violations of the principles of the academy. And in some sense, the latter should be easier than the former, which of course raises some interesting questions as to why there isn't the appetite to address them. I should say there are some contrarian exercises in the philosophy literature. People use kind of toy models to say, oh, well, what about in this particular hypothetical situation in which scientific fraud or misrepresentation could lead to desirable outcomes? Okay, well, I mean, that's a fun intellectual exercise to play, but I don't think it should be taken very seriously. In the concluding chapter, I reference some literatures on norms and institutions. Okay, so essentially looking to substantiate a little the position that I take, and the literature on institutions is primarily taken from the so-called feminist philosophy of science, which I think has now become, with a bit of reluctance using this word, mainstreamed in philosophy of science. In fact, the presidential award at the most recent Philosophy of Science Association went to a very significant feminist philosopher who I cite in this chapter. But at the same time, I caution against over-intellectualizing the approach. I think many of the improvements that are required and that are possible are not actually that complicated. I know a lot of people say this when they propose conclusions, but I think it's very much true in this case. What is lacking is the commitment to follow through on the foundational principles. If you look at the list of issues that the non-exhaustive list of issues I provide in the second bullet point, I think you can see that these are not intellectually complex, as it were. Probably important to note, again, for this audience, that this is a different discussion from that of how we allocate societal resources to areas of inquiry, right? So, for example, the debate about whether, in South Africa, as in other parts of the world, whether more resources should be allocated to, say, the social sciences or medicine rather than allocating them to the humanities, that's a different kind of question. What we're talking about in this instance is actually how the academy is structured, how rewards are structured, but also what the priorities are. So again, is it on ensuring that the conduct of intellectual inquiry, broadly defined, is consistent with a set of principles, or is it focused on a kind of economistic, so in some sense, imitating a particular form of economic thinking, an economistic notion that we can kind of use incentives much as people would in private corporations or in factories, as per the example I used in a previous op-ed, to get desirable outcomes without paying much attention to the dynamics themselves, right? So that's the appeal also of the incentive approach, is you don't have to get into the messy business of dealing with the dynamics of how the output is produced. What you do is you create the incentives and you rely on those to guide the actual practice and dynamics in whichever way, so long as you get the outcome, right? Now, essentially what I'm suggesting in the book, and I think is increasingly being recognized in the higher education literature, is that it doesn't work out that way. So again, consistent with a finding in other literature on incentives, the very use of an incentive undermines the dynamic that the policymaker is trying to amplify. And bear in mind, I tend to assume a benevolent policymaker here, or with a few exceptions when it comes to university managers, I tend to assume that the use of incentives, by and large, is benevolent, in the sense that the individuals who are employing this approach genuinely believe it's going to work. Of course, one could take a much more cynical view, right? But it doesn't matter. It's better to assume the benevolent approach, because if you can make an argument against it, then of course, if there's a less benevolent approach, then the argument just strengthens. So essentially, the use of incentives can undermine the very underlying dynamic that it's based on. So, I mean, this audience will be aware of the position that, for example, incentivizing research outputs seems like a sensible thing if we look back at some history of the academy. Okay, and one could argue about which histories one should be looking at. One sees that particularly important contributors who made genuinely important contributions that have stood up over periods of time have often published, say, a large amount. What they've published has been cited a great deal. They've maybe supervised a lot of graduate students and so forth. And one might look back and say, oh, okay, well, that's a reasonable measure then to determine seniority, to determine influence, to determine resource allocation. But and let's say that was the case, okay? But the very act of deciding to create that incentive then means that individuals are going to pursue those outcomes for reasons that were different to the original individuals that you had in mind, that are essentially the empirical basis for your incentive. So you've undermined the very dynamic that linked, and some of my work is also in causal inference. There was like a causal link, essentially, that you were relying on between these kinds of observable outcomes and the underlying dynamics. And the use of the incentive itself breaks the causal link. So you've undermined essentially the mechanism that you were relying on by the very action of intervening. Okay? And this is actually something that arises across a lot of domains, not just in the use of incentives. It's quite interesting when one thinks about causal inference and other kinds of policy interventions. But so that's basically one of the concerns about what's going on. And very clearly then, what you also see is that hypothetically, if those kinds of individuals exist in the academy, the use of the incentive, first of all, is going to essentially create other individuals who look like that, but aren't really being driven by the same motives. And we see that they might, for example, engage in fraud in order to produce these large numbers of publications. But at the same time, it could also harm the individuals who are in the academy, who are trying to operate on the basis of those prior principles. And again, we see this as well. I mean, I cite the example of Peter Higgs, who some of you may have heard of, because there was a fundamental physics particle named after him, the Higgs boson. And Higgs has said in a number of interviews that basically in the modern academy, he wouldn't have been able to get a job. And in fact, his university almost fired him. And the only reason, because he wasn't, after producing his fundamental contributions, he was then focusing on teaching and supervising students, and he wasn't producing a lot of research. And the only reason they didn't fire him, and this was discovered from some disclosed internal documents, was because they thought he might win the Nobel Prize. And in fact, he did. He went on to win the Nobel Prize. But and there are a number of examples from economics and other disciplines where academics who started in a previous era, which undoubtedly was not perfect, but in which there wasn't this hyper-incentivized set of dynamics, those academics who are widely recognized to have made fundamentally important contributions say that they simply would not have obtained posts, they would not have survived under the existing incentives and sets of priorities in the modern academy, and that's something that should be quite obviously of concern. But that kind of anecdotal evidence fits very nicely into the structure and into this argument that I make in the book. Okay, so I need to speed up a little bit. Let me say something about variation. Okay, so this has been a generic argument. I haven't really said much about different countries, different institutions, different disciplines. What I say in the book about disciplines is I focus on three characteristics. The ontological properties of what I call the ontological properties of the area of inquiry, the epistemological merits of the dominant methodological approaches, and the culture and norms of the community of inquirers. Very briefly, the first two parts really reflect a particular proposition, and it's somewhat novel, that I make in the philosophy of science chapters, which is that the ability of a discipline to approximate truth depends on the fundamental issues that it's looking at. So, for example, economics would be looking at issues such as unemployment and so forth that are fundamentally driven by human behavior, where something like particle physics is looking at the properties of particles that are arguably unchanging over long periods of time. So that's the one thing. And then the other thing is the actual methods and data that are available. And what I suggest is that it's the combination of those two things that determines the degree to which a discipline is more or less able to approximate truth. And why does that matter? That brings us to the third part, which is the culture and norms of the community of inquirers. Basically, what I suggest is that where the ontological and epistemological characteristics of a discipline are most favorable to approximation of truth, that places some limit on the harmful or distortionary effects of the culture and norms of the community of inquirers. So if I go back quickly to here, essentially the conformist and non-scientific factors can only have a certain degree of influence, because the ability of the discipline to approximate the truth is such that there's always going to be quite a strong pull towards truth approximation. Whereas in other disciplines where that ability is quite limited, whether because of the nature of the area of inquiry or the methods available or both, there's much greater scope for those negative effects to dominate. Okay, and I use economics as an example of a discipline where I think the ability to approximate truth is actually very low, and as a consequence, the negative culture and norms of the discipline have distorted inquiry to a very undesirable degree. To the point that I basically I use a term from another philosopher, facsimile science. I suggest economics is actually by and large a facsimile science. And that's something I'm going to elaborate on quite a lot in other work, of course, because my background is in economics and there's a lot more to say about that. So that's on disciplines. There will be variation across disciplines. I see Kian appearing, but I'm going to take another 5 minutes, Kian, because I only started talking at 5 past. So, but I will try and keep to that 5 minutes. Thank you. So there's variation across. There's going to be variation across disciplines, variation across societies as well, because different governments take different policy approaches, and that policy framework will determine the extent to which incentives or the degree to which incentives are harmful or distortionary, right? Because they're countervailing effects. There could be other aspects of policies that limit or exacerbate the degree to which incentives cause the kind of harm that I'm worried about, and that can of course extend to the academic communities in particular societies as well, right? And then finally, of course, institutions. The title of the book is The Incentivized University. There's been a lot, I note that in the higher education literature, there's been a lot less research. There's been quite a lot of research on variation across societies and variation across disciplines, not so much on variation across individual institutions. But what I suggest is basically you can't separate the question of institutional variation from the decision-making structures in universities. And where you have these more managerialist conceptions of progress, there's less likely to be any resistance to both the pressures towards metric-based incentives, but there's also less likely to be countervailing policies that limit the harm caused by these kinds of incentives. Okay, so what about implications for the academic periphery and decolonization, which of course has been a major topic in South Africa since Rhodes Must Fall in 2015. This is a bit long, but I'm going to read it because it's just the best summary I have. It comes straight from the book. There are various reasons why it's important to connect these issues to the preceding analysis. First, core periphery dynamics can be a major contributing factor to the harm caused by managerialist interventions to assess and incentivize scientific progress. Second, among the harms of these systems is the compounding of those same global inequalities for reasons that are unrelated to the actual merits of contributions to knowledge. Attempts to incentivize scientific progress of the kind that have become popular in the last half century can therefore be expected to worsen rather than address these problems. A third reason is that some preceding arguments could be used to continue or expand, and this is a bit more nuanced, to continue or expand the marginalization of peripheral researchers and communities. So let me stop there and basically summarize. Essentially, what could happen is that at the core, so I talk about facsimile science in two contexts, and I also suggest that in this kind of structure, where there are these incentives to produce output and try to get them into certain kinds of journals and so forth, what you have in the sort of weaker periphery, just weaker also in terms of less resources, but also in less quality and less capability, is a sort of imitative process which is not focused on fundamental quality. It's focused on achieving these kinds of measured outcomes. And that leads to something that's actually quite low quality and sometimes almost fraudulent. If that gets recognized by the core, then it's going to be used to justify further marginalization, right? So this becomes a vicious cycle where, for example, contributions from the periphery are already prejudiced against, editors, for example, are prejudiced against contributions from the periphery because they're associated with lower status academics, and status is what determines publication rather than quality. But then, because the periphery engages in a kind of imitative process which isn't quality-based, that is then used to justify precisely that kind of discrimination. The alternative possibility is that the periphery, countries and institutions see the kind of harmful dynamics that are happening, and they decide to cut themselves off, right? They decide to take an insular approach. And I very strongly argue against that, also in the context of discussions around indigenous knowledge systems. So I very much argue for the importance of maintaining international linkages and an international outlook while engaging with the fundamental problem of ensuring that the academy functions in a manner that's consistent with its foundational principles and its societal image and the basis on which public resources are devoted to it. Okay, so I just highlight there some of the key points. Right, so to conclude, some thoughts from South Africa, which, as I say, are not in the book, but which are partly based on what's in the book. So first of all, and I've said this in a number of my op-eds and so forth separately as well, South African universities have made the error of chasing metrics and implementing managerial systems instead of building institutions and cultivating, desirable norms. Rhetoric doesn't count. There's certainly a lot of rhetoric around. I think much of that rhetoric is not consistent with practice. And this is particularly something that should have happened in the post-apartheid era, right? So there was an opportunity in the 1990s to think very seriously about what kind of trajectory we wanted to put the higher education system on. I mean, that thinking did happen, but I think the choice to use incentives in a kind of managerialist approach was the wrong one. As I say, at the national level, this has been encouraged and compounded by the research incentive system. You could say, where did it start? It's kind of chicken and egg. Did it start with the universities having a particular kind of outlook based on their counterparts overseas? Did it start with the policymakers? Probably both. Decision makers, both within institutions and outside, are in denial about mediocrity and outright fraud in South African higher education, predatory publishing. I know there's some controversies about what that means, but I mean, I'm happy to defend particular definitions of it, which are fraudulent. And they're unwilling or unable to take difficult decisions and have been prioritizing their own interests and ambitions. So this is one of the exceptions why I don't necessarily assume benevolent decision makers. Decolonization and the ending of scientific independence, that should read Huntonji, there's a spelling error there, who I cited in the book and whose work I really like. And the ending of scientific dependence that's required by ambitions like the fourth industrial revolution, for example, are fatally undermined by these kinds of dynamics. So if you don't get the institution building right, you don't solidify quality, you don't ensure that the dynamics of the higher education system are positive, then pursuing these other kinds of things really is going to be a rhetorical exercise because you're not going to produce anything of substance on the other side. Of course, there'll be exceptions here and there, but at the aggregate level, you're not going to achieve your objectives. Notional achievements to date, including on these metrics, right? Including on the various metrics that have been adopted, university rankings, research output, this kind of thing. Those are going to be very fragile because there hasn't been a focus on institution building. It's been a focus on chasing the numbers, chasing the incentives, putting in incentives and creating academics who chase incentives. Those are the reversal of those metrics, I think, could happen very rapidly. And of course, then there'll be a lot of there'll be a blame game that's going to happen. And it's quite likely that in the existing context, the blame is not going to be allocated in the right places. And of course, this doesn't say anything about what is not measured, such as the quality of education, in terms of the quality of education that students are receiving within the university system, because it's not as easy to measure, right? And this is another one of the well-known problems of incentives, that they rely on a particular approach to measurement. And I discussed this at some length in the book. But the problem is that then if you can't measure things that are important, those tend to get neglected. And there's really no justification for that other than, oh, well, if we can't measure them, we can't use incentives, we can't use this managerialist approach. So we'll just hope that those kind of work themselves out and we'll focus on what we can incentivize. And then finally, for the purpose of this particular audience, and I think this view has definitely been informed by Kian's work. In the South African context, journals are largely functional cogs in the machine of producing output for appointments, performance assessments, and promotions. And that's not really how it should be. It's pretty hard to put that as a justification in the context of the societal role of the academy. The journals are really there just for academics to obtain appointments and promotions and defend their performance assessments. If that's the reason why journals are publishing papers, then we should probably be scaling down to a great degree what is appearing in journals. The purpose of publication is essentially to make available important to whatever degree contributions to knowledge. And it might be that, of course, there's overlap in these things. But to the extent that this is the driving force, what's described in this last bullet point, the outcomes are not going to be consistent with the founding, what one might call the foundational principles or the societal role of the academy. Thank you. I end on a positive note, which is just to say South Africa does have a strong enough subset of academics, disciplines, journals, policymakers, and enough resources to potentially set itself on a better path. That isn't true, I think, for all countries. And the focus should be on building high-quality local institutions, aware of global hierarchies and inequities, but we should nevertheless retain strong outward engagement. Thanks very much, Kim, and thanks to all of you.
Thanks, Sean. I think it's been a very interesting day today. Yours is another one of these fundamental interventions, questioning or asking questions about science, how to popularize it, how to introduce accountability, and so on. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm not going to talk anymore. I want to ask questions or comments. I do see that your promotional arm is at work in the chat. Really track down how to get hold of your book. You might want to just tell us how to get it in South Africa while we just wait for somebody to suggest put their hands up.
Right. Well, I've just added a note to the chat as I show on this link here. Many South African universities have actually got a subscription to the Springer catalog in which the book is published. So I think many participants will be able to download it. If not, you'll have to order a copy from Springer. I would suggest at this point, because it's priced as an academic book, I would definitely suggest getting your library to order it rather than paying for it yourself. But you can use that link where you can just look for the incentivized university and you'll find the Springer page.
Thank you. I don't see any hands as yet. Suzanne, can you see any hands? Anybody wanting to ask a question?
No, I cannot see any hands.
Okay, well, my takeaway from this is that it doesn't matter how that incentives don't actually affect science, the innovation in science. What incentives do is to output. And does output actually count for anything, especially when you think of Peter Higgs, 12 papers in his entire career, Nobel Prize, conferred upon him, yet, as he points out, he was an embarrassment to his university. These seem to be the essential contradictions that we're facing in the area of bureaucratization, accountability, metrics measurement, performance management, numbering, and we're not asking about quality, whether our work actually changes the world for the better, and how we popularize it beyond the academy. And I think I need to point out that one of NSEF's objectives is to popularize research, is to make it, as far as possible, useful for social policy, development, society, while at the same time encouraging basic research. I see, Labi, you've got your hand up, and Wieland got your hand up. So Labi first.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of the neoliberal, perspective on higher education has been driving a lot of the incentivizing issues. And both as in my institution itself, we're now beginning to incentivize, Q1 and Q2 journals and so forth. So it creates this thing that even those Q1 and Q2 journals are becoming markers of quality and so forth, when in fact it may not necessarily be so. So we need to question all of these things. So within our institution, it's really is, driven by issues of how much of publication units you can derive by publishing, how much of finances you get through the incentivizing that can allow you to travel and go to academic tourism and so forth. And I think from an editor of the journal perspective, what we also find is that there's a flood of articles that are being sent to us that is so descriptive in nature. And the only reason why people actually send these things is because of the recognition to get published by the institutions for the rewards. And I think we need to really find ways of addressing both while maintaining, obviously, an issue around, neoliberal agenda, but also be very circumspect about how we feed into, as journal editors, into that discourse.
Thank you, Labi. I think you put it in a nutshell. Wieland?
Yes, I'd like to say that I'm amazed that Sean has managed to give his whole talk without once defining what he means by incentive. There's no definition of incentive or dissection of forms of incentives. For example, there is a distinction between incentives that are designed to enable research to be done in the first place, and other incentives which are purely a reward, which do not make a difference to the research. And I think that it's a great defect in the presentation and possibly in the book that there hasn't been a discussion of what is meant by incentivizing and incentives. This is a major problem for me in listening to this talk, in the sense that there is no doubt that any researcher who is left, whether it be a Higgs or whether it be a South African Max Tyler, who got his Nobel Prize with even fewer publications than did Dr. Higgs. The question is to enable one to do the research. An institution has to incentivize people in such a way that they are able to get the funds and the equipment and the space and the students and the staff to be able to carry out their investigations according to basic academic principles. So without a proper analysis of what is meant by incentives, I think the whole analysis falls down. My second point is local about journals, which is the Editors Forum. I think that as somebody who has led research units and carried out research over many years in many different places, it is a very important intellectual exercise to be able to write a scholarly paper. It is a way in which you are forced to review the literature, you are forced to look at evidence, you're forced to look at your results, you're forced to sort out what it means or where the defects are and the missing bits. And therefore, to call this a complete waste of time, that this facsimile research which is being carried out is a complete misunderstanding of how people learn to do research. And the whole idea of a PhD thesis, for example, it is an exercise in intellectual development. And many papers are written as intellectual development, and not because they're making a revolutionary advance in our scientific knowledge. So these are just some of the points. I've got lots of other points to raise, but I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I just want to make those points and hear what Sean has to say about them. Thank you.
Thanks, Wieland. Well, let's get the other points in from you by email. We'll certainly follow those through, but let me hand back to Sean. Got a few minutes to respond.
Great, thanks, Kian. If I can just take those in order, Kian, I actually want to say something about your point about publicizing work and NSEF's approach. That's something that other institutions are doing. I mean, institutions in a broad sense. And I'm very concerned about that, actually. And I think I mentioned in the book that I should have given it more emphasis. I talk about impact metrics. See, the problem is when you have research that's being produced that isn't actually making a substantive contribution, and it could be worse, it could be fraudulent, it could be various other things. Focusing on societal impact is going to make its harm worse. It's going to exacerbate the harm, because now it's not just harm that's in the intellectual realm, it's also harmful in the social realm. And I see this a lot in economics. There's very weak work that's being produced in economics, but now authors have to write policy briefs, and those policy briefs then get turned into op-eds, and they're encouraged to try and influence policy, not because there's anything correct about the arguments that they've made, but because the university wants to see that they're making a societal impact. But if their research is wrong, or if it's weak, then they're making a harmful impact. But the thing is, the university doesn't care, because what they look at is the impact metrics, and those don't measure actually whether this particular economics paper is encouraging a policy that's harmful on a poor basis, or it's encouraging a policy that's desirable on a strong base. So I think that's a very serious concern, and I would like to see a lot more caution on that front for this reason. On Labby's point about the neoliberal approach and incentivizing particular journals, I mean, see, this is part of the problem, because there isn't enough good thinking about the system and its problems and so forth. Because under the existing system, for example, one can publish in an international journal that's extremely hard to get into. In economics, say, Quarterly Journal of Economics could take 3 years to publish one paper. You get 1 credit. You publish something that's close to an opinion piece in a certain South African journal that I won't name, it's barely a journal, and you also get 1 point. I could write one of those pieces in about 3 hours, right? You get 1 point. So that system is clearly a problem, because it incentivizes people to just churn stuff into notionally the lower quality journal, right? But at the same time, incentivizing these top international journals also doesn't make sense, because it doesn't reflect the local context. It doesn't reflect how much harder it is for a South African author to publish in one of these top journals. So again, the problem of just like tweaking the incentive system, fiddling at the seams, it really isn't going to work. The point about the flood of articles to journals, I mean, Kian is the one who made this point most lucidly for me before in some of his articles. And this question as to why students are being encouraged to publish in journals. If a student's produced a solid dissertation, great, they get a degree. There's no particular reason why a student should publish in a journal. And I guess this gets to Wieland's second point. Thanks for those questions. It may be important to write to know how to write a scholarly paper, but that doesn't mean that the way to learn is to publish it. So it doesn't have to be a revolutionary contribution. And yes, there's a degree to which I perhaps overemphasize revolutionary contributions, which, as I said earlier, are actually quite rare. But it should make a substantive contribution that's worth publishing. Bearing in mind that these days, of course, if a student has a dissertation, it can be put in an online repository. It is accessible. It is in some sense published, right? And people can access it. There's no particular reason why journals should be training grounds for individuals to learn how to write publications. And when we think about the societal resources that are required, and again, I think this is the point that Kian's made in some of his work, it's just infeasible, in fact, for journals to be playing that role. We have a flood of publications, even a flood of, I mean, I work across a lot of areas, and it's extremely hard to keep up with the existing literature in any single area because of a flood of publications, even good ones, right? Then we have this additional problem of people publishing for reasons that really have nothing to do with substantive contributions to knowledge or presenting evidence that's relevant to society. So I would strongly disagree with the view that journals should be sites for individuals to learn how to write scholarly papers. I think that should happen elsewhere, like in PhD programs. But at the same time, PhD contributions and dissertations should not be published just for the sake of it, and shouldn't be published just so universities can get research income. The point about definition of incentives, I think, is valid in the context of this presentation. I didn't go into that at all. I do have more discussion in the book, and one of the key distinctions I also make is between what one might call intrinsic versus extrinsic incentives. And so, I mean, you talk about the necessity of incentives. There's a sense in which one can say that incentives to some degree will always exist. So the fact that there's an opportunity for promotion, one could say that's a kind of incentive. But in essence, I'm talking first and foremost about the deliberate creation of incentives. So look, I mean, my background is in economics, so one can go into a lot of detail here about the foundations of human behavior, utility functions, these kinds of things. But the basic idea is the same as I think what people's intuitive understanding is, which is that an incentive is a mechanism that's intended to induce a particular kind of behavior, right? And in this case, we're talking about explicit incentives, okay? There are some cases I discuss in the book also about implicit ones. But one of the particular concerns is, and I think this comes out whether it's made clear or not in some of the literature, is a concern about intrinsic versus extrinsic incentives. And what policymakers are relying on is extrinsic incentives, and the hope that that's going to generate the same kind of outcomes that in the past, or with other individuals, intrinsic incentives, intrinsic motivations generated. And there are lots of reasons to believe that that's not the case. In fact, there are very few reasons to believe that it would work. So yes, one can get into the definition of incentives to a greater degree, but I don't think it's going to change the argument. Where I would agree with you is that once you want to start thinking in a more nuanced way about the kind of policy interventions, some of those distinctions will be more important. But I don't think it would change the argument. And there is, if that's any reassurance, more discussion in the book. But point noted, if I do this presentation again, I'll have a slide on definition of incentive. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, everybody. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. We're starting to eat into the next session. So let me thank Sean for his presentation. I don't know if you managed to get breakfast before you got up in Colombia, but now's the time to go and get a good cup of coffee. I did see you were drinking some en route, but thank you again. And let us know when you're back in the country so we can continue the discussion.
Thanks so much. And please, people are welcome to email me with any further comments or criticisms as well. Thank you.